If you would, let us begin in a word of prayer. Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing to you this morning, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Y'all remember Y2K, right? Y2K. New Year's Eve, 1999. Instead of staying up late partying, there were probably a whole lot more people that year who were running to Walmart at the last minute, grabbing extra cases of water, canned goods, packing their sheds, because this was the apocalypse, right? This is going to be the apocalypse. Computers somehow were going to explode or just not work, and we were going to lose all our financial information, and the world was going to implode when they turned the clock to 2000. All our money was being gone, and things were going to fall apart, right? This was Y2K. The only thing, though, once that happened and we woke up in the morning, the only thing we realized we really lost was our minds. Right? I had honestly forgotten about Y2K. I had forgotten about this whole thing until this week. Earlier this week, I had a couple of friends of mine, and they do a podcast, and I'm super jealous of them. They do this podcast, and they started talking about the apocalypse. They were talking about the apocalypse, and the image that they brought up was this memory we all have of Y2K, of New Year's Eve 1999. And how we all thought Y2K was going to make the apocalypse come upon us, right? One world government, it was going to be the cashless society, no more local economy is going to happen, there's going to be death and destruction everywhere, so you better prepare, get your stuff ready before it comes, it's the end of the world. So we did all this in those months and those days before New Year's. We bought a whole bunch of canned goods, food, survival material, thousands of water bottles and guns. I don't know if you've been watching any YouTube lately, but my son watches YouTube all the time. And one of these most common advertisements is actually for like army ration material. They'll send you a box and it's like 50 days worth for a whole family of 6 for like just $500. You can survive, just buy a bunch of these, right? And so we're still sort of in this Armageddon mindset. And so we'd buy all this sort of stuff, food, we'd buy water, people bought guns, they bought more land in order to live on this out in the boonies because the cities are going to get taken over and the madhouses and zombies, I think, or something like this is going to happen. We thought all of this was going to happen. All right, the end of the world. The end of the world. Churches, by the way, were actually buying up land too for their people. For their people. They would bring it in and form their own little enclaves if Armageddon came. Some of them were literally crying out from the pulpit, "Run for your lives." One guy at the time, a pretty popular preacher at the time, predicted from the pulpit leading up to Y2K. This is what he said. He said, within 3 months of Y2K, so like around March of 2000, there will be 2 kinds of people left in the world, he said. 2 kinds of people left. There will be those who, for whatever reason, manage to store up food. And the second kind of people will be those who are powerful enough to take it from them. And honestly, you couldn't quite tell which one he was rooting for or advocating for. Maybe both. What I think all of this shows, and this was my friend's point on that podcast, what all of it shows and what Y2K made us realize about ourselves is just how really afraid we are. How afraid we are. And honestly, that fear, I don't think has gone away. Like I said, that YouTube commercial, right? We're still afraid. Put us face to face. Put us face to face with the end of the world. Or put us just face to face with what we think might be the end of the world. And we're afraid. We're afraid. The prospect of our dying, of our ceasing to exist when we're made to see it, this makes us terrified. So afraid that we often will do stupid things, even immoral things. Y2K may just be one example of many. In fact, it is. We hoard water, we hoard food, Hoarding is a good word for it. We invest in ways to kill people because our ultimate goal is to protect ourselves and the ones we love, right? And this makes it a difficult thing to manage, to understand. How does this work? How do we do this? And so hoarding and hunkering down can seem like life-giving in some ways. But when you think about them and you dig down deep into what is driving us, we find out that we're still being dominated by death, dominated by it. We imagine everyone who isn't one of us is one of them, right? One of them. So we turn them into the enemy. And the enemy has to be destroyed because the enemy, and this is what we hear in apocalyptic scenarios, right? The enemy is going to be coming after our stuff. Going to come after our stuff. Come after our stuff. How could this not be the case? You just have to look at any post-apocalyptic show or movie out there, right? The bombs fall, or the asteroids happen, or the dinosaurs rise up out of the deep again, and it's every person for themselves, grab a gun, hunker down in some basement, and wait out until who knows what happens, right? This is how we imagine coming face to face with the apocalypse, with the demise of everything. Fear, especially our fear of death, makes us do anything and everything we can to save ourselves. Fear drives us to beat back death, no matter the cost, no matter the cost, no matter the cost to those around us, no matter the cost to the world. Fear drives us to do everything we can to preserve our lives. So why should we be surprised to hear that in Revelation 7, its common interpretation over the years has been like we're all back in 1999, Y2K. Everything's going to hell in a handbasket at the end of chapter 6, if you remember from last week. And the only way out, it seems, at the end of chapter 6 is if Jesus swoops down and utterly annihilates everything. Right? This is the picture we get at the end of chapter 6. That's how things are done when we're forced to come face to face with the apocalypse. It's how we handle death, guns blazing. But looking at chapter 7, as we move into chapter 7, strange enough, that's not what happens. Jesus looks like at the end of chapter 6, we hear the wrath of the Lamb has come. The sky has rolled up as a scroll already. The mountains are overthrown. The islands are turned on top of each other. And what we get is the wrath of God. Who can stand? And so we're expecting in chapter 7 that this is going to be that wrath displayed. But it's not. But it's not. You remember the story, right? John, he sees that big scroll in God's hand, and he walks up there, and John doesn't, Jesus does. He sees Jesus walk up there and start opening the scroll, and out comes this white horse with a rider who's probably Jesus himself, and the text says that this rider is ready to conquer. Then comes a red horse symbolizing war, and a black horse symbolizing famine, and then a pale green horse that's literally called death and says Hades is coming with him. If you get pictures of Tombstone and that movie, that's where he gets the line, okay? It's pretty great. All right. So this is literally the apocalypse, what's happening here in chapter 6 of Revelation. It's not good. The fifth seal, though, as we saw last week, takes this little turn. We see a bunch of martyrs. They're under the altar of all places, right? But that altar being underneath it is this important image because what happens on the altar? Sacrifice, right? Self-sacrifice of Jesus. Lo and behold, the text says these martyrs have been slaughtered for the word and for the testimony that they have given. They're crying out for vengeance. Their deaths aren't a good thing. They're not a good thing, even though their way of dying apparently is good in some sense. They've sacrificed themselves. That's the fifth seal. And then the sixth seal literally comes the end of the world. Earthquakes, solar eclipses, red dawns and blood moons. Even the stars are falling from the skies, and the mountains are being unseated. Hurricanes are ripping across the plains. The islands are lifted up out of the ocean and turned upside down. It's the apocalypse, folks. And it's way worse than Y2K. All the people are hiding. All the people are hoping. They're hoping that Jesus doesn't find them because they think if this is bad, that rider is going to be worse. So they think Jesus is going to be even worse than the apocalypse, if you can even imagine it. So this is where we are at the beginning of chapter 7. All right? 1159, 1999. Right in the middle of the oncoming apocalypse, the wrath of the Lamb has come. The question is, and the question that chapter 6 leaves us with, comes from the mouths of all the people that are cowering or in their caves. We left off here last week, and we said the question was, who can stand? Who can stand? Who is able to stand against the wrath of this glorious sacrificial lamb? And then chapter 7. Apparently, 144,000 people can stand. 144,000 can stand. 12,000 from every tribe of Israel. 12 tribes times 12,000. I did my math. 144,000. The number, however, is symbolic. Like most numbers in the book of Revelation, it's a whole bunch of people. All right? A whole bunch of people, in other words, will be able to stand with Jesus in the face of death. Somehow they're going to be able to stand. Now, if you take a look, it's not exactly clear where these 104,000 actually come from. Are they part of that group of cowards we just read about under the sixth seal? The ones that are hiding beneath the mountains, wanting them to fall on them so that they can get away from Jesus? Did the 144,000 come from this group? Then they figure out all of a sudden that they could join in with Jesus, that things are going to be okay? Are they drawn from there? Or are they drawn from some different group that we don't know about? Where do they come from? The text doesn't tell us. We don't know. What we do know, however, is all the destruction that was happening at the end of chapter 6 has somehow been put on hold. Maybe what we were getting was just a glimpse of what was going on, but there's this little interlude that we have here that's chapter 7 that we have to go through first before any of the sky actually gets rolled up as a scroll. Chapter 7 is that interlude. It's this kind of calm before the storm. And God tells an angel in Revelation 7, 2-3, the way we see this is God tells this angel to hold back from wreaking all that havoc. Do not damage the earth or the sea or the trees, the angel says. Do not damage the earth until we have marked the servants of our God with a seal on their foreheads. And then John, we're told, this is really important, John, we're told, hears something. God sends the angel to say, don't do all the destruction yet. And then John hears something. John hears a number. A military census, 144,000, that number we just said. John hears a military roll call being taken. There will apparently be 144,000 who can stand in the face of the wrath of the Lamb. And I heard the number of those who were sealed, John says, 144, sealed out of every tribe of the people of Israel. But the important thing to get here is that John hears it. He hears it. This isn't what John sees. It's what he hears. John sees something entirely different when he looks at that army. He hears that 144,000 are going to be sealed from the tribes of Israel, but then he turns around and he looks and he sees something completely different. Sees something completely different. What he sees is an even bigger group, bigger than 144,000. And where do they come from? Every tribe and nation on earth. Not just Israel, every tribe and nation. And they're not waging war. This was a military census. He hears and he turns around and sees somebody who's not waging war. In fact, the war is already done. The war is already done. There was a great multitude, verse 9 says, that no one could count, from every nation, from all the tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were robed in white with palm branches in their hands. They cried out in a loud voice, saying, salvation belongs to our God who is seated on the throne and to the Lamb. What in the world is going on here? What's going on? I thought the Lamb was coming to utterly destroy everything, but then we get the destruction not happening, and we get this army called up, and yet it's not an army after all. What is going on here? To really understand it, I think you have to turn back a few pages. Turn back a few pages to a distinction that we're first introduced to in Revelation chapter 5. John hears, and then John sees. This hearing something and then seeing something remarkably different has happened beforehand. Has happened already. Back in chapter 5, John first sees, or when he comes into that big scroll and those 7 seals, he first sees it up there in God's hand, all right? If you can remember back then, John's crying out, he's weeping, he doesn't know, nobody thinks can open up the scroll, nobody can open up the scroll, or so he thinks, until he hears. He hears something. What does he hear? One of the elders speaks up and says, "Do not weep." The elder says, "Do not weep, for behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has conquered, and he can open the scroll and its 7 seals." John hears this. He hears it. He hears that a lion has conquered. But what does he actually see? Do you remember? He turns and he sees not a lion, but a lamb. And not just any lamb, but a bleeding, slaughtered, sacrificial lamb. A lamb. He doesn't see a lion, he sees a lamb. Then I saw between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders a lamb standing as if it had been slaughtered. John hears a lion, but he sees a lamb. Now take this back to chapter 7. John hears a military census going on, 144,000 from the people of Israel. But what he actually sees is an even larger number from every tribe, every nation on the whole planet, not just Israel. What John sees is the actual fulfillment of that military census. What John sees is what's really there, what's really going on, and it goes beyond all of our expectations. All of our expectations. What John hears is a lion's roar, but what he sees is the lamb's blood. What he hears is an army marching to war. What he actually sees, though, is a massive parade of people who have already won. People who are already standing before the throne and before Jesus. Are these folks the ones from the 6th seal? Is this everyone who is cowering under those rocks back in chapter 6, verse 15? If so, they're now all, we're told, robed in white. And they all have this palm branch in their hands. And they're waving these palm branches because that's what you did when you were welcoming people back from war after they were victorious. They're welcoming the Lamb. It seems like John knew that a lot of this would throw us for a loop. It seems like he knew this is not really what we'd expect, so he throws some more explanation in here. This is why we get, I think, verse 13. John says, "Then one of the elders addressed me, saying, 'Who are these robed in white? Where have they come from?' I said to him, 'Sir, you are the one that knows.' Then he said to me, 'These are they who have come out of the great ordeal. They've washed their robes, they've made them white in the blood of the Lamb.'" This is not how the apocalypse is supposed to go. There's no hoarding here. There's no stockpiling of water or toilet paper. There are no missiles flying. This is nothing like Y2K. This is instead a multi-ethnic army of the Lamb proudly standing before God because they've been washed in the Lamb's blood, Christ's blood, blood from the original sacrifice on the cross, sacrificial blood. This is what John sees. It's what truly is and will be. Let me tell you a story that might help explain what's going on here a little bit better. I've told you a little bit of this story before. Today I'm going to give you a lot more details. It's the story of a Christian, a pastor, who lived really right at around the same time John, who was writing this, lived. Same time the revelation was happening. This pastor might have actually been one of John's disciples. We're not exactly sure, but it's possible. His name was Ignatius. Ignatius was basically the generation, he was in this generation of church leaders that comes right after Paul and Peter and the apostles. If you think those guys died, who was next? Ignatius was next. Ignatius was next. So think the year 100, which means Ignatius was literally living in the world the book of Revelation was written to and for. In fact, Ignatius was arrested. This is how we know about him. He was arrested and he was carted off to Rome to face trial and ultimately to die. He knew that he was going off, that this was going to be his end. So on his way, he quickly pins off some letters, 7 of them, 7 letters, to a lot of the same churches that you hear about at the beginning of the book of Revelation, like Ephesus and Smyrna. He's writing to these guys too. So he's being carted off on his way to Rome, and he writes 7 letters. Listen to how Ignatius talks about witnessing to the life of Christ and the life of sacrifice in the face of death. If you remember, this is what the martyrs, how they were martyred. Ignatius is facing the same thing. He says, I write to all the churches. I write to all the churches. This is in his letter to the Romans, the same church that the Apostle Paul wrote his letter to the Romans to. I write to all the churches and impress on them all that I shall willingly die for God unless you hinder me. I'm going to willingly die for God. Don't hinder me. I ask you not to show an unseasonable goodwill towards me. Don't do it, he says. Allow me to become food for wild beasts, though through whose instrumentality, he says, it will be granted me to attain to God. Last week, when we read about that pale green horse and the angel of, or the horseman of death, this 4th horseman was going to kill, we said, with the sword and with famine and with pestilence. And then the last thing, wild beasts. Ignatius is literally living that. Listen to what he says next. I am the wheat of God. I am ground by the teeth of the wild beasts, that I may be found the pure bread of God. Ignatius is using communion language here. He's talking about the Lord's Supper, all right? And rather entice these wild beasts, he says to the Romans, he says, entice them that they may become my tomb, that they may leave nothing of my body, so that when I have fallen asleep in death, I may not be found troublesome to anyone. Then shall I be a true disciple of Jesus. Now, when I read this, I often struggle with it because I'm like, this guy has a death wish. What is going on here? Is he suicidal? What's this guy's deal? But no, I don't think it's any of that. You read through his letters, this is a common refrain, and it's not a death wish. He doesn't want to die in the sense of he's eager to find pain and non-existence. He's eager to join with Jesus in Jesus' death. What Ignatius has is a better relationship to death than we do. He views it differently. Death doesn't have dominion over Ignatius like it does the rest of us. In fact, listen to how Ignatius talks about being free. Being free in the face of death. He says, when I suffer, I shall be the freedman of Jesus Christ and shall rise again emancipated in Jesus. And now being in bonds for Jesus, I learn not to desire anything worldly or in vain. So permit me, he says, to be an imitator of the passion of my God. Let me be that sacrifice like Jesus sacrificed, like he calls us to sacrifice. Not every preacher back in Y2K said we should be stockpiling food and water and weapons against this one world government. Some said that we should be doing exactly the opposite of that. We should be giving away our water, giving away what food we have, our bread and our wine, maybe our very bodies. If the apocalypse is going to come, they said, then we need to be the ones sacrificing ourselves for others, for everyone. Why? Because that's what Jesus did. If anyone has Jesus within himself, Ignatius said, let him consider what I desire. Let him have sympathy with me. In other words, let the ones do the same. Do the same thing. What Ignatius in Revelation 7 are doing is they're forcing us to rethink our relationship to death and the vice grip it has on our lives. Just consider why. Consider why you do what you do in life. Just sort of anything. But especially why you get anxious or you get scared. Think beyond the obvious. This past Friday at Homebrew Theology, we were talking about ghosts and scary things because it's Halloween coming up, right? So I thought this would be a good idea. Let's talk about ghosts, right? And we asked, why do things like ghosts or zombies and ghouls and dark witches and everything like this, why do these things scare us? Why does the dark make us afraid? Why are we scared of witches and whatnot? The answer is, or was on Friday, because we're afraid to die. We're afraid. We don't know what's around the corner. It may be our death, right? Maybe our death. So much of what we do in life is built around our fear of death and how we can stave it off, keep it off in the future, escape it as long as we can. We buy cars. I bought a car. I bought a Subaru because I can't drive in the rain or in the snow or the ice, and I don't want to die. I've gotten close multiple times, and I thought, I'm done with that. I'm getting myself a Subaru. I'm not being paid by Subaru for this sermon. All right, if this was a podcast, that would be a break, and then we'd have this fun commercial about the new Outback coming out or something like this. All right, so, but this is why we think of that. Safety, right? What is going on? Recalls, we got to make sure. Okay, so these are things. These aren't necessarily bad questions, but what we're come to find out is when they dominate our thinking, then what we're being dominated by is not life, but actually death. It's actually death. So why do we work? To buy food. Why do we need food? To survive. Why do we save money and buy insurance and look for the best hospitals? Because we want to live as long as we can and as happy as we can, as well as we can. Why even, we might ask, and my children aren't here so I can ask this, why do we have sex? All right, why? Well, we might say, it's fun, and you'd be right. But there's another reason too, right? Why are our bodies even created to be able to do that? To survive, right? Literally, to live longer as a species, to have children who carry on our name. Even our sex drives are products of our bodies that are doomed to die. And God is saying it doesn't have to be this way. You don't have to live with your mortality always driving you crazy. We all feel this doom, though, right? We feel it. It surrounds us. Even when it's not on our minds, it dominates us. Death consumes us. The very hint of our own demise defines us. Our fear of death drives us to do everything we can to live, to the point that we actually begin to do something dangerous. We begin to worship life itself. Karl Barth once said that life is not a second God. Life is not a second God. That may sound a bit insensitive today in the era of COVID, but it's true. Our pursuit of life can often become so strong that it literally replaces God. Replaces God as the one we worship. Ignatius talks about the more he was good to his captors, the more they beat him. But he still recommends being good to them. Pray without ceasing, he says. Pray without ceasing on behalf of other people. For there is in them hope of repentance, that they may attain to God. See then that they may be instructed by your works. Be meek in response to their wrath. Humble in opposition to their boasting. To their blasphemies return your prayers. In contrast to their error, be steadfast in the faith. And for their cruelty, manifest your gentleness, Here is a man who is literally being borne around in chains and beaten as he's going to Rome to be fed, he knows, to wild beasts, eaten by lions. And he's saying, do good. Don't repay evil for evil, even if it kills you. Ignatius is staring death in the literal face, and he says, okay, hand me that robe, why don't you? Hand me that white robe. Because if there's going to be any blood on this robe, it's going to be Jesus's, and it's going to be mine. It's interesting how similar Ignatius sounds here to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. Blessed are the meek, they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they're going to be called children of God. And you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. What if? What if the Sermon on the Mount is less a lesson on our morality than it is a lesson on our mortality? What if the big problem that Jesus is trying to fix here in the Sermon on the Mount is how we should relate to death? How should we relate to death? Just ask yourself, why do we sin? Why, as people, do we sin? Why are we so greedy? Why are we envious? Why are we angry? Why is our first inclination whenever somebody hurts us to strike back, to hurt them back? Why is our first inclination even to defend ourselves? Why? Why, when COVID first hit, did we all go to the store and buy that stuff? Why, when Y2K happened or was about to happen, did we think we needed to stock up and hunker down, take care of ourselves at any cost? Why do we love Martin Luther King Jr. and his civil rights movement, but we can't imagine actually being nonviolent ourselves? What's our relationship to death? Does it dominate us? Are we more driven by death and our desire for life than we are by God and the blood of Christ? And what would it mean to not be so dominated by death? What would that look like? How do we get there? How do we conquer like Ignatius? How do we conquer like Jesus? How do we conquer the dominion of death like the Lamb who was slain? The answer, it seems, and this comes not just from Ignatius, but also from the Bible, it's not by simply willing it. You can't just flip a switch and all of a sudden be like, oh, peace. No more dominion of death over me. That was awesome. Can't do that. Even Jesus struggled with the dominion of death. The way he struggled with it is all over the place in the Gospels. We see it in the garden, weeping, right? Blood and tears. We see it, it's constantly on his mind. You will know, the Son of Man must be given up. Jesus goes off into the wilderness to pray, right? He's struggling with his mortality. Jesus brought his mortality to God. He prayed about it. He wrestled with it. In this way, Jesus familiarized himself with his own death. He wasn't morbidly dwelling on it, I don't think. He recognized that death, however, was going to come. It was going to come. Jesus didn't like it. That much is obvious. He wept blood and tears, like we said in the garden. But he accepted that death was going to inevitably happen because, after all, it comes to each and every one of us. But it's not the end. Maintaining our life at all costs is not the greatest good. Jesus came to understand, wrestling with his death before the Father. God, he understood, is the greatest good. Communing with the Lamb in his own sacrifice is the greatest good. Jesus could love the whole world sacrificially, even unto death, because he wasn't so afraid of death that he was dominated by it, that it controlled his actions. He could accept it, and that made him able to love despite it. I'm going to tell you one story, and then I'll be quiet. Matthew 14, Jesus wraps up feeding the 5,000. He feeds 5,000. He puts his disciples in a boat. By the way, the 5,000, the disciples and the 5,000 are all nervous. They're looking for food because they're afraid of death. Jesus feeds the 5,000. He puts his disciples in a boat and tells them to go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. He's going to go up, however, onto the mountain and to pray. He prays all night before the Father. He's just heard, by the way, right before feeding the 5,000, he just heard about John the Baptist and how King Herod had beheaded John the Baptist. And Jesus knows his own time is coming. His own time is coming. So he goes and he prays all night long. He brings his mortality before God. And when he looks out at the disciples, they're still there out in the middle of the sea. And the winds and the waves are buffeting up against them. Jesus sees them. And if you read it in Matthew, he doesn't just go straight out to them. He just prays some more. And then he gets up and he calmly walks out onto the water. Matthew puts it this way: when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It is a ghost," they said. They cried out in fear, but Jesus immediately says to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." Take courage. Don't be afraid. One thing we have to remember about the sea is the sea in the Bible and from the Old Testament, Genesis 1, when it hovers over the formless void, the chaos of the world. At the end of the Bible, when the beasts of Revelation come out of the depths of the sea is chaos. The sea is death. The raging sea is our demise, and Jesus is calmly walking on it. How is he able to do that calmly? We miss the point when all we think is, well, Jesus is God. Of course he can walk on water. This is true. But there's a more important reason that's being said here. The reason he's so calm, the reason the waves don't even seem to touch him, is because he's been before the Father. This is the big struggle of our lives, to wrestle with our mortality, with the weakness of our flesh. There's nothing to be gained by denying our fear of death, by ignoring our concerns for our loved ones, by purchasing insurance to make us feel better. That's just psychological. There's nothing to be gained by ignoring it. What's to be gained is when we lift up our fears and our concerns and our anxieties before God. When we bring them before the Father, the Creator of the world, the very giver of life himself, and know that he is Lord even over death, then we don't need to be afraid of it anymore. We don't need to be dominated by it. It's not the end. This is not the apocalypse. This is not what we're worried about. And in that, like Ignatius said, we are freed. Free to put on those white robes, free to be washed in the blood of the Lamb, free to stand before the wrath of God, free to love even our most bitter enemies, no matter what comes. Don't let death reign in you. Instead, be free. Amen.